Tiny Epic Dungeons is a really fun game. And you may be like, well, okay then, I guess we're done here. Thank you very much, Jack. But this point must be made abundantly clear, or else none of what I say is going to have any value. So let's restate. Tiny Epic Dungeons is a really fun game in spite of itself, in spite of all the compromises it makes in order to fit the tiny moniker, in spite of the rule ambiguity necessitating an epic amount of clarifications, in spite of the absolute nightmare of a rulebook. Tiny Epic Dungeons is a really fun game. And if you can put up with all of that, it is one of the best dungeon delves I've played in years.
In this cooperative game, players explore the procedurally generated titular dungeons that unfold as new rooms are explored, sourced from an assortment of semi-randomized rooms and mini-bosses based on player count, which is really to say hero count, because no matter how many players are playing, 2 to 4 heroes will be used, but nothing is stopping you from using multiple heroes. And what heroes they are. Dungeons has you take on the roles of various heroic fantasy archetypes that in truth draw a bit too much stylistic inspiration from World of Warcraft for me, feeling neither timely nor timeless, but either way there is a good array of them. Heroes have life and energy tracked throughout the game, as well as some default stats of 1 to 3 dice they'll roll in the 3 different types of checks, and some basic equipment printed on their cards. Most abilities and spells require both success in a specific type of test, then energy to spend on said ability, and if your life ever drops to 0, your hero must take a rest action at the beginning of their next turn.
Speaking of actions, heroes take turns in which they can move as many spaces as their speed allows and then take as many minor and one singular heroic action as proffered by their character card, equipment, or room. As they enter new rooms, goblins with their quite excellent numbered meeples may be revealed, who serve as the game's standard baddies. Now these goblins are really just avatars for the goblin card that's drawn and put into their respective slot when they are populated on the board. And the cards themselves detail the stats of the goblin, their behaviors, the rewards that you get for killing them, as well as what they do upon their activation, which we'll get to in a bit. And killing them is something you're going to want to do often because A, you get rewards, B, they spring up like daisies, and C, if you ever have to place a 5th goblin active in the dungeon, well, you lose. Eventually, as the dungeon is explored, the equal to hero count mini-bosses will too be discovered, drawn from a series of mighty scallywags, each with their own equally awesome meeple. It's only after slaying these and discovering their boss's lair will the big bad be revealed, who themselves count as a massive room with several locations that players will navigate around. This big boss room card gives the game a suitably epic finale, as well as some interesting tactical options. If you beat the big nanner themselves, well, you win the game. If you run out of time or let the goblins run amok, well, it's curtains for players.
On a surface level, I love how the game captures the rugged spirit of heroic adventure, clearly referencing board and video games alike in its design. From HeroQuest to Diablo, the generational DNA of dungeon delving can be found. Procedurally generated environments, legendary items to discover with set bonuses, and loads of atmosphere blending the atrocious and adorable with the dark cards and vibrant meeples. But getting to the core of the whole thing, a couple really smart systems feel particularly robust and welcome, such as the torch track counting down at the end of each player's turn, populating more goblins and initiating enemy activation phases, where all baddies present in the dungeon perform their easy-to-follow attack and movement behaviors. This gives a certain clockworky and reliability and pressure to the game, especially with a few levers to pull, like making torch movement be a cost in some actions or a result of success or failure in a test, and that defeating each mini-boss rewinds the clock 6 spaces, incentivizing the desperate rush to have them meet their end. And the skill system is great too, where heroes attempting anything from attack to casting a spell to avoiding or even disarming a trap, along with most other heroic actions, roll a number of dice equal to their stat in that category, and select any one dice to use along with any of the lower plus numbers on dice, and apply any further modifiers to determine if they pass. The dice give a lot of versatility, and the ability to increase or reduce dice results using 2 energy at a time gives a load of options. I particularly like that the dice have energy or health rewards that are claimed by the hero, but only for the dice they rolled but didn't select for the skill test, adding a lot of easy to understand but super impactful decisions.
Overall, the game has exceptional bones. It has a clever action system, smooth AI, the equipment and abilities are extremely evocative, and it's a reliable but ultimately challenging puzzle as time ticks by. As a fast-paced hour-long dungeon crawl, it absolutely delivers and offers a lot of replayability, something I was initially leery about, seeming as how this doesn't have that classic dungeon crawl campaign with persistent accumulation and growth carried from game to game, which is why it's frustrating that these genuine strengths that are totally independent of the game's diminutive stature are tarnished by trying to cram it all into such a tiny package.
Look, I get it. I understand the appeal of small box games, and I've enjoyed my share of tiny epic games in the past, but this is a case where I think a good game could have been even better by being a bit larger in form. You know, like moderate epic dungeons. There's little in the way of concrete examples, clarifications, and first pass clarity, and woe be to those who need to reference a rule but can't remember where they read it. Formatting everything in such a tiny form makes for easy mistakes, such as my own not centralizing the dungeon entrance in the maximum 7x7 grid, though in that case I do kinda like the snaking exploratory possibilities of a non-centralized entrance, even if it can ramp up challenge when gobos are spawning over vast distances. And the symbols, there are so many symbols. Even your symbols have symbols, necessitating the breakout gatefold cover in the already convoluted rulebook. I'm all for making games language independent when you can, but learning the symbology in the game is a real bear, and the combination of symbols that are not clearly explained in their timing, application, and effect when combined is the source of a vast amount of confusion, and thankfully, clarification of the game online. This is a clear example where slightly bigger components with text, particularly on character, enemy, spells, and equipment cards, would all have been way more appropriate. And speaking of components, the game, especially the deluxe version with promo content and expansion content and all the content, while really cool, is exceptionally difficult to organize and contain in the small shells, let alone just the base game box, now iconic to the Tiny Epic line.
Tiny Epic Dungeons is a good game, both my new favorite in the Tiny Epic line and one of the more fun and ambitious dungeon delvers I've played to date, but it does have some serious barrier to entry, largely self-imposed by its commitment to the shtick. If you want to work your way through the rough outer shell to that juicy, adventurous fantasy core, there are a lot of official and unofficial clarifications online, and the Epic Rules interactive site is far and away a better tool than the official rulebook. With those resources, a dash of grit, and a bit of patience, in my experience, I think it is worth seeing it out. Tiny Epic Dungeons is a really fun game. And that's our review, but I want to hear from you. What is the game that had the biggest barrier to entry for you that wasn't necessarily the cost involved in a financial term, but ultimately when you saw it through, it was worth all of your patience? Put it in the comments. I want to hear about it. And as always, thank you for watching. Thanks for supporting. Thanks for being an awesome community. You know that I've been Jack for the Cardboard Herald.